Piercing alarms signaled a flatline, and Dr. Penhaligon froze. He was Memorial West's star trauma surgeon, yet staring into a soldier's shrapnel-torn chest left him completely out of his depth. Suddenly, the quiet, relentlessly mocked temporary nurse shoved past him. "Move, doctor," she commanded coldly. "I've got this." The linoleum floors of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the graveyard shift. It was 0300 hours on a Tuesday, a time when the world was supposed to be dead, or at least deeply asleep. But for Avery Jenkins, the quiet was just a temporary ceasefire. Avery was a civilian trauma nurse, or so her badge claimed. To the rest of the staff in the intensive care unit, she was simply the reliable, unflappable wallflower who always took the worst shifts. She didn't gossip at the nurse's station. She didn't complain about the double shifts. And she always, without fail, wore a long-sleeved navy blue scrub jacket, even when the hospital's HVAC system broke down in the middle of a sweltering DC August. "Jenkins, you're going to melt in that," Dr. Thomas Arris had joked just hours earlier, sipping his lukewarm coffee. Arris was the chief of trauma surgery, brilliant credentialed from Harvard, but undeniably insulated from the ugly reality of dirt and grit combat medicine. "I run cold, doctor," Avery had replied, her voice smooth and devoid of any inflection that might invite further questions. She liked it that way. Invisibility was a luxury she had paid for in blood. The illusion of a quiet night shattered exactly 14 minutes later. It didn't start with a standard ambulance siren. It started with the deafening, bone-rattling thud of a modified Black Hawk helicopter landing unauthorized on the hospital's VIP helipad, bypassing standard medevac protocols. Seconds later, the double doors of the trauma bay were kicked open by 4 men in unmarked tactical gear, their faces smeared with grease paint and sweat. They were JSOC Joint Special Operations Command. Avery knew the look. She knew the smell. Copper cordite and adrenaline. Between them, bleeding out onto a specialized military gurney, was Lieutenant Commander Bradley Hayes, SEAL Team 6. "We need a surgeon right damn now," one of the operators roared, his hand pressing down violently on Hayes's neck. Blood was pulsing between the operator's fingers in a rhythmic, sickening spray. An arterial bleed. The trauma bay erupted into chaotic motion. Dr. Arris rushed in, flanked by 2 residents and a half-dozen panicked nurses. Avery hung back by the crash cart, her eyes snapping to the monitor, calculating Hayes's vitals before the leads were even fully attached. BP 60/40. Heart rate 140. He's tanking. Hypovolemic shock. "What happened?" Dr. Arris demanded, his voice cracking slightly, as he saw the sheer volume of blood pooling on the floor. "Classified," a sharp, authoritative voice barked from the doorway. The room froze for a fraction of a second. Standing in the entrance was Admiral Richard Hastings. With 3 stars on his collar and a chest full of ribbons that spoke of a lifetime of commanding from air-conditioned rooms, Hastings was a legend in naval intelligence. He was also notoriously ruthless, a man who viewed protocol as his personal weapon. He had arrived via motorcade, having been debriefed on the disastrous covert op before the chopper even landed. "The only thing you need to know, Doctor, is that this man is a Tier 1 asset, and if he dies on your table, your career dies with him," Hastings said, his icy gaze sweeping the room. "Fix him." Dr. Arris swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he grabbed a pair of hemostats. "All right, let's get access. I need 2 large-bore IVs, push uncross-matched O negative, and get me a clear field on that neck." But it was a mess. The bullet had entered just below the collarbone, tearing through the subclavian artery and shattering the clavicle. Shrapnel had created a massive cavity. Every time Aris tried to clamp the bleeder, the ruined tissue turned to mush under his instruments. "I can't find it," Aris panicked, sweat dripping from his brow into his surgical mask. "There's too much blood. Suction. Give me more suction." "Pressure is dropping, Dr. 50 over 30, a resident yelled. Haze began to seize his body, arching off the table, as his brain was starved of oxygen. The monitor screamed a high-pitched warning. The operator who had brought him in punched the wall, a string of curses leaving his mouth. Admiral Hastings stepped closer, his face turning an angry, mottled red. "What the hell is happening, Aris? Stop the bleeding," Hastings bellowed. "I'm trying. The artery is retracted into the chest cavity." Aris was entirely out of his depth. This wasn't a clean civilian car crash. This was a ballistic nightmare. "We need to crack his chest, get the saw." "He'll bleed out before you get through the sternum," a quiet voice said. The room fell dead silent, save for the frantic beeping of the monitor. Every eye turned to Avery. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't raised her voice. But the absolute chilling authority in her tone cut through the panic like a scalpel. Before Dr. Aris could object, Avery stepped forward. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed a specialized Foley catheter from the supply cart, something entirely unorthodox for chest trauma, and moved to the head of the table. "Jenkins, step back," Aris shouted, horrified. "What are you doing?" "Saving your patient," Avery said coldly. With blinding speed and precision that defied civilian logic, she shoved her ungloved fingers directly into the jagged, bleeding wound cavity. Aris gasped, and the residents recoiled. Avery didn't flinch. She fished through the hot, slick muscle, found the retracted stump of the subclavian artery by pure touch, and pinched it shut with her index finger and thumb. The pulsing fountain of blood immediately stopped. "Thread the catheter," Avery ordered, her eyes locked on the resident. When the resident stood frozen in shock, Avery glared at him with a ferocity that made him physically flinch. "Thread the damn catheter into the artery, now inflate the balloon, and clamp the line. It will act as a temporary shunt. Move." The resident fumbled, but obeyed, sliding the tube over Avery's guided finger. She inflated the balloon effectively, plugging the massive internal bleed from the inside. The monitor's frantic pitch stabilized. "BP 80 over 50, climbing." Dr. Aris stared at her, his jaw completely slack. The JSOC operators looked at the quiet floor nurse with sudden heavy scrutiny. But Admiral Hastings wasn't relieved. He was furious. "Who the hell are you?" Hastings demanded, marching up to the operating table and pointing a rigid finger at Avery. "What is a civilian floor nurse doing performing unapproved, unsanctioned surgical maneuvers on a classified military asset?" Avery slowly pulled her blood-soaked hands from the wound, grabbing a towel to wipe them. She didn't look at the Admiral. She looked at Dr. Aris. "He's stabilized for now. You have about 45 minutes to get him to the main OR and do a proper vascular graft before the tissue necrosises." "Did you hear me, nurse?" Hastings roared, stepping into her personal space. "This is a restricted zone. You shouldn't even be in this room, Ares. I want this woman out of here, and I want her arrested for medical malpractice." Avery finally turned to look at the 3-star Admiral. Her eyes, a striking cold gray, held zero intimidation. "With all due respect, Admiral," Avery said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm whisper. "If I hadn't stepped in, Your Tier 1 asset would be in a body bag by now. The tension in Trauma Bay 1 was so thick it threatened to choke the oxygen out of the room. Admiral Richard Hastings was a man accustomed to blind obedience. For a nameless civilian nurse to stand before him, coated to the elbows in the blood of a Navy SEAL, and speak to him with such open defiance was unthinkable. "Arrest her," Hastings snapped, looking over his shoulder at the JSOC operators. Now, the lead operator, a towering man with a thick beard and eyes hollowed out by days of combat, didn't move. He looked from Hastings to Avery, evaluating her. Operators knew their own kind. They recognized the predator's calmness, the economy of motion, the absolute lack of fear. The operator took a slow step back, shaking his head slightly. "With respect, Admiral, she just saved my commander's life." "I'm not touching her." Hastings' face contorted with rage. "Fine, I'll have the MPs do it." He pulled a radio from his belt. "Security, this is Admiral Hastings. I need a detail in Trauma Bay 1 immediately." Dr. Aris finally found his voice, stepping between Avery and the Admiral. "Admiral, please, she just performed a balloon occlusion blindly. It was miraculous. We need to focus on Hayes." "Shut up, Aris," Hastings snarled. He turned his venom fully onto Avery. "A civilian nurse. You think I don't know what you are? You're a liability. This is a black book operation. No one lacking a top-secret clearance is even supposed to breathe the air around this man. I want your credentials. I want your file. Now." Avery stood perfectly still. The adrenaline of the trauma response was fading, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. She had spent 5 years burying her past, erasing the person she used to be. But the past was stubborn. It had a way of bleeding through the bandages. "My name is Avery Jenkins," she said evenly. "I'm a registered trauma nurse. My clearance is on file with the hospital administrator, Jenkins." Hastings spat, pulling out his encrypted tablet. He was a man obsessed with knowing everything in his domain. He quickly punched her name into the Department of Defense database. "Let's see just how registered you are." As Hastings typed, Lieutenant Commander Hayes suddenly groaned on the table. The sedation was wearing off, and the immense pain was breaking through. His body jerked violently. "Hold him down! He'll rip the catheter out!" Dr. Aris yelled. Avery lunged forward across the table to pin Hayes's uninjured shoulder, putting her entire body weight onto him to keep him from thrashing. "Hayes, stay with me, do not move," Avery barked, slipping instinctively into a command tone that echoed with military precision. In the violent struggle to hold the thrashing SEAL down, the fabric of Avery's oversized scrub jacket caught on the metal railing of the gurney. As Hayes bucked upward, the fabric tore. A loud rip echoed through the bay, and the entire left sleeve of Avery's jacket was sheared away, pulling the collar down over her shoulder. Avery froze. The bright, unforgiving surgical lights shone down directly on her exposed arm and neck. The entire room fell into a deathly silence, save for the rhythmic beep-beep of the heart monitor. The skin on Avery's left arm didn't look like skin. It was a chaotic, horrific tapestry of thick, raised keloid scars, melted tissue, and pale, dead nerves. The burn scars began at her wrist, twisting like violent vines up her forearm, consuming her bicep, and sprawling across her collarbone before crawling up the left side of her neck. Interspersed within the melted flesh were dark, jagged puckers, shrapnel entry wounds that had healed ugly. They were not the scars of an accident. They were not the scars of a civilian tragedy. They were the unmistakable violent signature of a close proximity improvised explosive device compounded by the chemical burn of white phosphorus. Dr. Aris stared horrified. The residents looked away. Even the hardened JSOC operators visibly stiffened, recognizing the physical cost of a war zone nightmare. But it was Admiral Hastings' reaction that changed the temperature of the room. Hastings dropped his tablet. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack. The Admiral stared at the scars, his eyes tracking the specific pattern of the burns. His gaze moved to a small, nearly obliterated patch of skin on her upper shoulder, right at the edge of her collarbone. There, barely visible beneath the melted tissue, was a remnant of black ink. A tattoo. A dagger plunging through a medical cross wrapped in barbed wire. The insignia of the cultural support teams. The tip of the spear. The female Black Ops medics who rode with the Rangers and SEALs into hell. Hastings' face drained of all color. The arrogant red-faced commander vanished in an instant, replaced by a man looking at a ghost. He took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. He looked dead pale. "You," Hastings whispered, his voice trembling in a way that shocked everyone in the room. "The Korengal ambush, Operation Red Dawn." Avery slowly let go of Hayes as the sedation finally took hold again. She stood up straight, making no effort to cover her ruined arm. She looked Admiral Hastings dead in the eye, and the raw hatred in her stare was heavy enough to crush bone. "You're dead," Hastings stammered, staring at her face as if truly seeing it for the first time beneath the civilian disguise. The entire medical detail, the Chinook, it went down in the valley. There were no survivors. "That's what the official report said, wasn't it?" Admiral Avery's voice was venomous, cutting through the silence. "That's the report you signed." Hastings swallowed hard, sweat suddenly beading on his forehead. You're Major Avery Miller." The name hit the JSOC operators like a physical blow. The lead operator gasped, stepping forward. "Miller, the Angel of Korengal. We were told you burned in the crash." "I did burn," Avery said quietly, never breaking eye contact with Hastings. "For 3 days in that ravine, waiting for the extraction team that never came, waiting for the medevac that someone at command scrubbed because the airspace was deemed too politically sensitive to risk further assets." Dr. Aris looked between the nurse he had patronized for months and the terrified Admiral. "I don't understand," Aris whispered. "Jenkins, who are you?" "I'm the medic they left behind to die, Dr. Aris," Avery said, pulling the torn fabric of her scrub jacket back over her shoulder. "But unfortunately for the Admiral, some of us refuse to stay buried." Hastings looked like he was going to be physically sick. The operation in the Korengal Valley was his darkest secret, a catastrophic command failure he had swept under the rug to secure his 3rd star. He had written off the trap squad, declaring them KIA to avoid a PR nightmare leaving them to fight to the death against a Taliban onslaught. He had built his entire legacy on their graves. And now the ghost of his greatest sin was standing in front of him, covered in the blood of a new generation of soldiers, doing the job he had abandoned her to die doing. "Major Miller," Hastings croaked, trying to find his authority, trying to salvage his reality. You shouldn't be here. You're AWOL. You're legally deceased." "I'm a civilian nurse," Avery interrupted coldly. "And right now, I'm the only person in this room who knows how to keep your asset alive for the next 30 minutes. So, unless you want another dead soldier on your conscience, Admiral, Avery pointed to the door, get the hell out of my trauma bay. The silence in Trauma Bay 1 was no longer merely tense. It had morphed into a suffocating, almost physical weight that pressed down upon everyone present. Admiral Richard Hastings, a man who had built a glittering, untouchable military career on the bedrock of strategic deceptions and buried casualties, stood entirely paralyzed. He was staring at the grotesque, melted flesh on Avery's arm, as if it were a venomous serpent preparing to strike. The overhead surgical lights illuminated the beads of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, casting deep, harsh shadows across his suddenly aged face. For 5 agonizing years, Hastings had rested easy under the fabricated certainty that Major Avery Miller had burned to ash in the remote, unforgiving ravines of the Korengal Valley. He had personally authored the heavily redacted after-action reports. He had signed the posthumous commendations, shaking the hands of grieving families with rehearsed, solemn sorrow. He had classified the entire disastrous operation, ensuring that his catastrophic order to withdraw air support, an order made to protect a covert intelligence asset over the lives of his own medical and tactical personnel, was buried forever in the deepest, blackest vaults of the Pentagon. Yet here she was, the Angel of Korengal. She was alive, breathing, and holding the immediate survival of his current operational success entirely in her blood-stained hands. You have absolutely no authority here, Admiral. Avery reiterated her voice, cutting through the sterile, antiseptic-smelling air with the precision of a scalpel. She did not raise her tone, nor did she blink. The sheer, unadulterated coldness in her gaze forced Hastings to take another involuntary step backward, his polished black dress shoes slipping slightly on the bloody linoleum floor. Your jurisdiction ended the moment you decided my squad was an acceptable tactical loss. Now, step outside or I will personally have these operators remove you. Hastings' shock rapidly curdled into desperate cornered fury. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against the starched collar of his pristine uniform. He whipped his head toward the JSOC operators standing guard near the sliding glass doors of the trauma bay. "Chief O'Connor," Hastings bellowed, spittle flying from his lips in his panicked rage. "I am giving you a direct lawful order from a flag officer. Arrest this woman immediately. She is a deserter, an undocumented security risk, and she is unauthorized to touch that man. Subdue her now." Chief Petty Officer O'Connor, the towering battle-hardened lead operator whose hands were still coated in his commander's blood, remained entirely motionless. He slowly shifted his weight, his heavy tactical boots planting firmly into the floor. He looked at the frantic Admiral, then turned his intense, hollowed gaze toward Avery. O'Connor knew the legends. Every operator in the special warfare community knew the hushed, tragic campfire stories of the cultural support team medic, who had reportedly held off a dozen insurgents with a sidearm, while desperately triaging wounded rangers in a burning Chinook, only to be abandoned by top brass. O'Connor slowly lowered his weapon, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Admiral," O'Connor said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that offered no quarter. "The way I see it, this woman is currently acting as a life-saving medical mechanism for my commanding officer. If you interrupt her, Lieutenant Commander Hayes dies. If he dies, my team's entire mission is compromised. Therefore, sir, with all due respect to your rank, I am countermanding your order under tactical emergency protocols. Nobody touches the Major. The sheer insubordination echoed off the tiled walls. The other 3 JSOC operators immediately closed ranks, stepping forward in silent, terrifying unison to form an impenetrable wall of Kevlar muscle and lethal intent between the commanding admiral and the operating table. Dr. Thomas Harris, completely out of his depth, but recognizing the shifting power dynamics, quickly focused his attention back to the bleeding patient, Major Miller. Harris stammered the name, feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue after months of calling her Jenkins. He swallowed his pride and his shock, his hands hovering over the surgical tray. The balloon catheter is holding the pressure, but the tissue is severely compromised. We need to move him to the main surgical theater right now, or we are going to lose the arm and possibly his life. Then let's move Dr. Avery, commanded her military persona, fully resurrecting from the ashes of her civilian disguise. She grabbed the headboard of the gurney, her scarred, ruined arm flexing with surprising, undeniable strength. O'Connor, get on the radio. Tell the surgical floor to prep OR Room 4 for emergency vascular reconstruction. Tell them we are bringing a critical Tier 1 casualty up the service elevator. No stops, no delays. As the operators and the medical team forcefully shoved the heavy gurney past the stunned Admiral, Hastings lunged forward, grabbing Avery's uninjured arm with a desperate, crushing grip. His eyes were wide, frantic, and filled with the terrifying realization that his entire legacy was evaporating. "You cannot do this, Miller," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her ears. "If you walk out of this room and reveal who you are, I will ruin you. I will have you court-martialed for desertion. I will see you thrown into Leavenworth for the rest of your natural life. You are a ghost. You need to stay a ghost." Avery stopped. She slowly turned her head, looking down at the Admiral's manicured hand gripping her scrub sleeve. Then she looked up into his panicked, terrified eyes. "You already ruined me, Richard," Avery whispered back, her voice echoing with the screams of the men she couldn't save 5 years ago. "You burned away my life, my team, and my identity. But I didn't stay dead. And tonight I'm bringing the ghosts of the Korengal back with me." She violently yanked her arm free from his grasp, leaving him standing alone in the blood-soaked trauma bay as the doors hissed shut behind her. The glaring, brilliant lights of Operating Room 4 illuminated a scene of frantic, hyper-focused coordination. For 3 grueling hours, Avery Miller and Dr. Thomas Harris worked side by side in perfect unspoken synergy. The civilian facade of the quiet, submissive floor nurse had entirely vanished, replaced by the commanding, authoritative presence of a seasoned combat medic who had operated under mortar fire. Dr. Harris, a brilliant surgeon in his own right, found himself willingly deferring to her battlefield expertise as they painstakingly reconstructed Lieutenant Commander Hayes's shattered subclavian artery. Outside the heavy steel doors of the surgical suite, a silent war was raging. Admiral Hastings had immediately rushed to the hospital's secure communication center, desperately pulling every political string he possessed. He ordered military police detachments to lock down the hospital corridors, fabricating a story about a dangerous psychotic impersonator who had infiltrated the intensive care unit. But Hastings had severely underestimated the fierce, unyielding loyalty of the JSOC Brotherhood. Chief Petty Officer O'Connor had already bypassed the local command structure, entirely using his encrypted satellite radio to connect directly to the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff. When the final surgical suture was securely tied and the heart monitor settled into a steady, strong, reassuring rhythm, Avery stepped back from the operating table. She let out a long, shuddering breath, stripping off her blood-soaked surgical gloves. She looked down at Hayes, whose pale face was finally regaining a healthy hue of color. Against all medical odds, he was going to survive. As the anesthesia began to lift, Hayes groaned, his eyelids fluttering open to adjusting to the harsh surgical lights. His bleary, drug-hazed eyes slowly focused on the woman standing over him. He saw the horrific winding burn scars climbing up her neck, and then his gaze settled on her face. A weak, tired smile briefly touched the corners of the SEAL's lips. "Angel," he whispered, his voice incredibly rough and barely audible over the hum of the machinery. They said you were dead." "Not today, Commander," Avery replied, softly, gently, resting her hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Rest now. You're safe." The heavy OR doors suddenly burst open. 6 heavily armed military police officers stormed into the scrub room, their weapons lowered, but their hands resting aggressively on their sidearms. Behind them walked Admiral Hastings, a triumphant, malicious sneer twisting his features. He had successfully manipulated the local command, spinning a narrative that painted Avery as a hostile threat to national security. "Arrest her," Hastings ordered, pointing a trembling accusatory finger at Avery. "Cuff her and isolate her in holding. Nobody speaks to her. Nobody questions her." The MPs moved forward, producing heavy steel handcuffs. Avery did not run. She did not fight. She stood perfectly still, her chin raised in a posture of absolute unshakable defiance. But before the officers could even touch her, a deafening metallic crash echoed from the hallway. Chief O'Connor and his 3 operators shoved their way through the perimeter, effectively blocking the doorway with their sheer, intimidating mass. Behind them walked a man who made the entire room instantly freeze in their tracks. It was General Marcus Vance, the formidable, uncompromising commander of Joint Special Operations Command. He had flown in via helicopter from Virginia the moment O'Connor had securely transmitted the tactical alert. "Stand down, officers!" General Vance barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The MPs instantly snapped to attention, stepping away from Avery. Vance turned his cold, piercing gaze toward Admiral Hastings, whose triumphant sneer had completely collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Marcus," Hastings stammered, frantically trying to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Listen to me, this woman is an AWOL deserter. She has illegally infiltrated a classified medical environment and poses a direct imminent threat to—" "Save it, Richard!" General Vance interrupted, stepping into the surgical suite. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive. "Chief O'Connor just handed me this drive. Major Miller gave it to him while they were